Hello, this is Barbara Peterson, the Poison Pen. It's my real pleasure today to run over, say, the last 30 years that Ian Rankin and I have shared time and experiences together. We come in on Ian just as he is discussing what is happening with his archive, which goes back even longer than 30 years. So here's Ian.
At the University of Edinburgh. And they've now taken my archive. So when I was downsizing last year from a very big Victorian 3-story house to a tiny flat, comparatively speaking, they said, well, look, we'll take all your manuscripts, your notes, your correspondence and all of that, which they duly did. And it was lovely that they did it. And there's now a curator who's an archivist who's working on it full time, getting it into some kind of order. And she keeps getting me in for meetings or sending me photographs and going, when was this taken? And who is that? Who's this letter from? What does this mean? What does that say? I can't read that handwriting. So it's been a hoot. I mean, there was one photograph recently she came up with, which was me and Margaret Atwood outside a bar on Rose Street in Edinburgh. And she said, what year is this? I went, I don't know. I just literally don't know. And since I stopped keeping a diary, I can't even tell you. Maybe Peggy knows. I sure as hell don't.
So I've known you since 1990, and it's been interesting, to watch. I was looking back on the trajectory of your career, and some people, soared at the top with a first book, which I think myself is a very hard thing to live with. Our observation is success is harder to withstand than failure or even a slow curve. And then, looking at what you've accomplished, I mean, just the volume of your short stories alone is tremendous that have been published. You've won the Gold Dagger, and then you went on to win the Edgar and the Diamond Dagger, and all of these awards, and there are reams of annotations about your career, and as you say, your archive that you've donated is huge. But I still remember having coffee with you in Edinburgh, or you're coming to the first mystery conference about your con here when you were was a Fulbright fellowship, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was a Fulbright fellow, yeah.
And, it's so interesting. And even seeing a book like West Wind come back after 30 years and be timely again. I think your publisher was right to say that there's a whole new audience for it, regardless of how small the sales were then. Because now, anything you do gets much more attention than it would have,
Sure, but I'm afraid that's the end. That's the end of the. We've been through the archive. There's nothing else in there. I mean, there's partial books. There's ideas for books. There are TV treatments, film treatments, film scripts, all kinds of things that I've written. But I ain't going to publish them. I think this is it. There's one thing. There's my very, very, very first novel, which is a comedy. And that is in the archive, and that's the only copy of it in existence, typed manuscript. But I ain't letting anybody publish it in my lifetime.
If you really, in your lifetime, because I have heard authors say they never want it to be published. I always say, then why don't you destroy it? But somehow they never can bring themselves to do that.
But having been a PhD student, I've been a research student, I want the stuff to be there for the students of the future. And I think it's particularly interesting, although this may just be my ego, that I represent the last generation of writers who will have a proper written archive.
Yes.
I mean, I've got letters in there from Ian Banks, from Val McDermott, from Ruth Rendell, P.D. James, Reginald Hill, William McIlvanney, lots and lots and lots of letters from writers, most of whom are now deceased. And we now live in an age where people don't write letters to each other anymore. What's the archive of the future going to look like? Somebody's tweets and their Instagrams.
It's a very difficult thing. You can see in a filing cabinet behind me, I have 2 drawers of exactly what you're saying. And I can't bring myself. I have like Edith Pargeter, Ellis Peters, when I were correspondents, Phyllis James and so forth. And I don't know what to do with them because, as you say, they're probably among the last written material that we are going to see from so many writers. So I haven't figured out a Poison Pen archive, but the staff and I have been talking about. We recently found files for our newsletters that go back forever, and so we may try to look at some. 30 years is a long time.
It's, well, I mean, mine went back a lot further than that. I mean, mine went back to, you know, when I was trying to write poetry and short stories in my late teens. So it's a whole life. I mean, it was like 30 huge big archive boxes of stuff that some poor swine is now having to go through, wading through like treacle, trying to make sense of it and put it in some kind of chronological order. And you know, it's the kind of thing I would have killed for when I was a student doing the life of Muriel Spark. There was very little on Muriel Spark, the chosen subject of my thesis. And if there had been something like that, ironically now her archive, some of it is also in the National Library of Scotland, and I've got to open some of the boxes up that had been delivered from her home in Italy and actually have a look at some of the stuff that's in them, which was a thrill. But yeah, I mean, it's the past. You know, kids, you go, this was typed on a typewriter, a portable typewriter. A what?
Yes.
These are floppy disks. This is my first novel on floppy disks.
Do you ever feel an impulse to finish your thesis? Because I think
No, none whatsoever. No, there's hundreds of pages of it in the archive, hundreds of pages, whole chapters of it, but it will never be completed. So, and I've got honorary doctorates now, Barbara. What do I need a doctorate for? I've got I think I've got 4 or 5 of them, for God's sake. I don't need to work for them anymore.
No, I didn't think it was for the glory. I just thought, you know, it was a project that might have been interesting to complete. Let's talk a little bit about music in your life, because in your somewhat checkered work career, I loved it when you just said swine, because my favorite of all your previous occupations is when you were a swineherd. I just love that. But as I recall, you actually, you were in a band for a little while, and are you in a band currently?
Well, I was in a band when I was 18, 19 called the Dancing Pigs,
Right.
punk band, new wave band. I introduced them into Black and Blue, the Rebus novel, as a very successful band, like REM or somebody. But in real life, we only played about 6 gigs and then fell apart. And a few years ago, I was asked by a few friends, all roughly the same age as me, i.e. should know better, if I fancied, you know, getting together and just rehearsing, jamming, whatever. I can't play a musical instrument, so they said I better do vocals. So, and it was fun, and we got some songs that we were fairly happy with, and then we went into a studio and we recorded one of them as a single, a 7-inch vinyl single, and that was fun. But half the band, well, the one member of the band moved to London, which didn't make it easy. One member of the band was poached by another band, and a couple of members of the band went off to join that band in a kind of part-time format. So, leaving me and the drummer, basically. And while that other band were getting quite successful in that they were recording and putting out an album and playing festivals, my band, Best Picture, were in abeyance. And that was true up until about November last year. And in November last year, we got asked if we would support a fairly well-known band called Hipsway at some pre-Christmas gigs in Scotland. So we got together, did some rehearsals, and we did our set, which is like 5 or 6, 7 songs. And we thought, this is fun, we're enjoying this. And we keep saying we must get together and try and do something. We've got lyrics, we've got tunes, we just need to get in a room together. That's not going to happen anytime soon, but we just need to get in a room together and try and record something else. And I don't know. I wouldn't say I'm the world's best singer, but apparently I'm a fairly competent front man. That's what's important when you're playing live, is a front man, somebody who can confront the audience and bend them to their will, so they don't boo and they don't throw stuff at you.
You've written quite a lot about the importance of music when you're writing, that you have playlists, and you know that it's a big part of your project. You and Michael Connelly, I think in particular, have always been
most crime writers are. I mean, most crime writers are frustrated rock stars, you know. I mean, Val McDermott's playing in a band these days. They had a tour, but that got cancelled because of the virus. Lots of us would rather be rock stars than writers, and Michael's among them. I'm one of them as well. Mark Billingham. There's lots, but we just don't quite have the whatever it takes to do it. So we have to introduce music into our books. And the latest, not Rebus, the one that comes out in November, which is called A Song for the Dark Times. That's a line from Brecht, Bertolt Brecht, and it's in one of his pieces. Someone says, "But you know, when the times are getting dark, will there still be singing? Yes, there will be songs about the dark times, or singing about the dark times." And I thought, you know, September, October last year, when I got the idea for this new book, I thought those were dark times. I'm writing about dark times. The world is a pretty messed up place at the moment. Geez, what did I know? What did I know? I'm so glad I chose to set the book in 2019 and not the summer of 2020. I would have been in real trouble if it had been set in 2020. Anyway, that book, which is named after, it's got a song thing going on with it, features a playlist that Rebus's friend Siobhan Clark has put together for him. And the playlist on a CD, because he doesn't do streaming or anything. So she burns him a CD, and she's entitled it Songs for the Dark Times. And he says, "What do you mean by that?" And she says, "Well, you know, songs to make you think, songs to cheer you up, songs that might get you dancing." And he goes, "Dancing?" And she goes, "Okay, maybe tapping your toes." Because he ain't a dancer, whatever else he is in life. Rebus is not a dancer.
You've also done some plays, or at least you've published at least one play script that I can think of, maybe two.
I've published 2 play scripts, but only one of them was Rebus. I can't remember if you saw both of them or not. The first one was called Dark Road, and that was done for the Lyceum Theatre in Edinburgh. And it was a woman cop, very senior woman cop at the end of her career, thinking back to a case she didn't quite think had been handled correctly, and the ramifications of that, and her falling out with her daughter. Then last year, was it last year or year before? Must have been the year before last. I did one called Long Shadows, and Long Shadows was a Rebus stage play, which was pretty. I mean, the first one, Dark Road, only ever played at the Lyceum Theatre in Edinburgh. Although it sold out the run, they found it really hard to sell it on elsewhere because it was a very complex production and a very expensive production. Having learnt that lesson, Long Shadows was a play that could be toured, and did tour, went all over the UK. I don't think it's played outside the UK. But it did really well, and that was published as well. It's not the same thing, though, reading a play script. I remember that from school days when we had to study Harold Pinter and Shakespeare and various other playwrights, that reading it was never quite the same thing as seeing it performed. But it was fun. And so I was asked to do a follow-up. So at the moment, I'm working on a follow-up to the Rebus play. It's in the very early days. I'm working with another playwright, and he's actually doing most of the heavy lifting. So I came up with a story, and we sort of bounced the story around in the characters, and he's going to have to structure it. And then once he's structured it, we'll get back together again and give it a really good polish. God knows when that'll be produced, though, because you know, people I know in the theatre are just desperate. They go, when are we going to put? When will audiences come back? And when will the theatres reopen? Nobody has any idea.
Well, it is difficult to know that, Ian, but I've talked to several authors who find that the real blessing, if there is one, in being quarantined is that there is so much more creative time. And it gives you a chance to do a project or two that maybe under the normal, exigencies of life, you just wouldn't get to.
It's absolutely true. I mean, I was going to have to put the new novel aside so that I could go to the States in March to do the Virginia Book Festival with John Grisham. I was going to be on stage with John Grisham. That was why I was going. And I was very excited about that. And of course, that got cancelled. That was the beginning of the lockdown, basically. And so I had all that time that I'd set aside for the American trip. And in that time, I was able to finish the new Rebus novel ahead of schedule, get it sent off to the publisher and the agent. And then while I was waiting for their feedback, work on the play. And then once the play had gone off with the playwright, so he could sort of put it together, was able to do short stories and essays and introductions to other people's books. I mean, I'm sitting here with an introduction to a graphic novel that I'm writing, a friend's film script that he asked me to comment on, a top 5 that I've been asked to do for the Washington Post. Wall Street Journal. There's all kinds of things that I'm doing that I probably would have said no to, because I would have been too busy doing other things or on tour or going to book festivals. And now I'm getting time to do it. So, I mean, again, it's very self-centered, but I've barely noticed a lockdown because I come to my room, which I'm sitting in just now, and I write during the day. And that's what I've always done. I've always locked myself away in isolation and written books. And in the early days, that was all I did because nobody wanted me to go on tour. Nobody wanted me for interviews. Nobody wanted me to do other projects. So I had all the time in the world to write. And that's what it feels like again. It feels like I'm this young, vigorous writer once more. Hooray. I've just turned 60, by the way. 60.
Well, no tears for me because you already know how old I am. But it's true that writers really led sort of self-isolating lives, and many of them complained they didn't have enough quarantine life, so to speak. You mentioned graphic novel. That's something you've done, what, a couple of so far? Why are you interested in graphic novels?
I did one. I keep looking this way because that's where my bookshelves are. I did one graphic novel, a 200-page graphic novel, Dark Entries, for an existing comics character called John Constantine. And that was because I've always been a fan of comics. When I was a kid, there wasn't a bookstore in our little village. There was a library, but it was very small. I grew up on comics. My parents weren't great readers. There weren't many books in the house. And comics were my gateway drug to the hard stuff of novels. And when I was a kid, I tried to draw them and write them, and I devoured them. And I've always been a fan, and I still read them. And when I was given the opportunity to write, when I did it. And since then, I've done a couple of just little comic strips, little one-off things, little projects for friends and stuff. I did one about the First World War. There was a book of collaborations of artists and writers about World War I to celebrate the anniversary of 1918. So it would have been 2018. And that was fun. It was a 7 or 8 page comic strip that I did set in the present day. I enjoy doing it. It stretches you. It makes you think about storytelling in a different way. It's a different way of looking at the world. It's a different way of getting your point across. Yeah, and it's nice to sometimes collaborate with other people. Like collaborating on the play is fine because somebody will say, I mean, the last Rebus play, the first Rebus play, I did it with another playwright, Rona Monroe, and she sat down and said, "Why are we doing this? And why would Rebus do this? And why is Rebus still interested in being a cop? And why has his life been taken over by this urge to get to the center of things or get to the answer to these puzzles?" And she made me explain things that I maybe knew subconsciously, but I'd never had to explain to myself or anyone else before. So that was a lot of fun, and it means that it keeps me on my toes. It keeps me on my toes, and it means that I don't get bored with the genre, the character, or myself.
I think putting illustrations in the story is very powerful. There's a whole Tolkien thing going on at the moment, you know, illustrated Tolkien. But I was thinking, I don't think I've ever told you this, but when I was a kid in a suburb of Chicago in Winnetka growing up, and I'm trying to remember whether he drew Dick Tracy or whether he wrote Dick Tracy, the ostensible, you know, the guy was just Gould, but this was somebody who worked with him. And whichever he did, he lived across the street from my grandparents. So he used to give us previews, you know, about what was going to come on. Because Dick Tracy was a really hot thing. And you remember they did great things like two-way wrist radios, you know, where you could actually have a visual image. He was way ahead of his time. The other thing I remember.
Yeah, that was basically the Apple Watch, right? Dick Tracy had an Apple Watch.
Absolutely.
Basically what he had.
And there was another great series of, I'm trying to remember what they were called, but I remember Flash Gordon and the Emperor Ming. And basically they were big little books. They called them, quite thick and not terribly big, but they had these fabulous illustrations. They tended to be more science fiction and fantasy than other things. But I can remember that it was the visual impact of the evil Emperor Ming and his dreadful daughter, Flash Gordon, you know, the stalwart hero.
Yeah.
That really made those stories come alive.
But you were sitting there in the big city, Chicago. I was sitting in a coal mining village of about 700 people in my teeny tiny bedroom, about 6 feet by 6, with a single bed and a bureau, and that was about it, and lots of posters on the walls. And comics and stories and songs, music, all of that became my escape. I mean, I could use my imagination, and with the aid of those tools, I could go anywhere. I could go anywhere in the universe at any point in time. I could escape that tiny, constricting, confined space and visit universities throughout history. And it's an extraordinary thing. And that was what drew me to storytelling in the first place. It's what drew me to comics. It's what drew me to try and be a writer. It was a fun way of spending time by using your imagination to have these extraordinary adventures that you gave to your characters. When I was in high school, sort of from the age of about 14 till I was 18, every week in the English class would be given an essay to write, but the essay was a short story. And that was my favorite thing to do the whole week. My favorite thing was to sit and write a short story. And then the teacher would look at it, and I remember one of them was called, what was it called? Paradox, which was the title of a song by Hawkwind. And the story was about a guy who's insane, but thinks and you think he's a president of the USA, but he's actually in an asylum. We wish. I wrote it, and he said, "Why do you call it paradox?" I said, "Just because it's a great word." I was just so in love with words, you know. I didn't know what it meant. I just wanted to use it. And he said, "Well, look it up in the dictionary, and you'll find it's really got nothing to do with your story at all." So that was a learning lesson. I used to sit and read the dictionary. You know, I'd do crosswords, and I would get the dictionary out and just read it for fun and jot down interesting words and what they meant. It was the start of just a love of language and what language can do. And my first novels and my first stories were very flowery, very rococo, the language in them, which is why I find them a little bit hard to read now if I do ever see them. But I learned very quickly. The first Rebus novel, I think, is very flowery compared to the second Rebus novel. The second Rebus novel, by the time we get there, the language has been stripped back and it's much darker in some ways than the previous book, because by then I had started to read crime fiction. I didn't read crime fiction per se when I was writing the first Rebus novel. So it's a pretty steep learning curve once I realized I had become a crime writer by accident.
How difficult, Ian, was it for you to go from a small village off to university? Was that something that you were encouraged to do by your parents, or were they somewhat dismayed that you didn't learn a trade?
Yeah, well, they were delighted I was going to go to university. I was the first member of my family to go to university, but they thought to learn a trade. So until I was 17, the plan was I was going to become an accountant. I was going to go and study economics and accountancy. And then I had this epiphany, summer holidays, summer vacation, when I was 17, that no, what I really wanted to do was to study literature, study English. And I broke the news to them. I think they were a bit bemused. What kind of job are you going to get with that when you finish teaching? So I wasn't going to be able to keep them in a lifestyle they wanted to become accustomed to, obviously. You know, they grew up in a council housing, you know, like they didn't own their own home, they never owned a car. They were, you know, left school at 15 and got jobs in factories. It was that kind of background. And I went off to uni thinking this is great because at university people will understand me in a way people can't understand me in my poetic soul. They can't understand me in my village, but they'll understand me in Edinburgh. And sure enough, at Edinburgh, I met people who felt more like me, people who wanted to be filmmakers, directors, writers, musicians, artists, all kind, you know, doing projects, trying to make movies, trying to start literary magazines, starting a student newspaper, reviewing films, trying to review books for the local radio station, trying to get a band started, that was the Dancing Pigs, etc., etc., etc. And all that extracurricular stuff was hugely useful to me, but I was struggling with the work. I really did. I haven't been one of the clever ones in my high school. Suddenly I was one of the less clever ones because I was surrounded by the cleverest of the clever, the best of the best. And first and second year, I really did struggle. I just barely made it into third year. And then something clicked in third year, I think because I got to choose my subjects to a larger degree than previously. And I got to choose American Lit, which had been my passion. And once I got to do American literature, I was off and running, and I could leave Wordsworth and Thomas Hardy behind, and Beowulf and Chaucer, and actually read stuff I was interested in, like Thomas Pynchon and Ken Kesey and Robert Lowell. And so third and fourth year were great. And then when I left university, the cold, hard world outside did not appeal to me, so I begged them to let me back in to do the PhD, and I got lucky. I mean, they turned me down the first time. And then for some bizarre reason, a month before the course was due to start, I got a phone call saying, look, you're in. You can come and do a 3-year funded PhD on the novels of Muriel Spark. And that was it. I was off and running because I said, well, what would Muriel want? Would Muriel want me to do a thesis about her? Or would she want me to sit and try and write my own books? And I wrote 3 novels in 3 years. at the behest of the Scottish taxpayer, because I was getting paid to do it.
Tell me about the Fulbright. Did you apply? Is that a competitive thing? Did you have to apply for the Fulbright that brought you to the United States to study?
Yeah, the Fulbright was a special one. It wasn't just it wasn't a normal Fulbright. It was administered or administrated by the Fulbright Commission, but it was actually money from Raymond Chandler's estate. And what they wanted was for one bright crime writer to go to the US for 6 months to 9 months, 1 year, and the following year an American writer would go to the UK for 6 months or 9 months. And the first year it was introduced, I applied, and I think I made it to interview, but I didn't get it. And so I thought, well, that's that. And then 2 years later, somebody said, why don't you try applying again? I thought, well, are you allowed to do that? Can you apply again? I didn't get it last time. Why would they give it to me this time? Anyway, I applied, went down to London for the interview, was interviewed by several high-ranking people. And they said, you've got it. Here's $20,000, go to the States for 6 months. Now, what you're supposed to do, because Fulbright were involved in this, was be placed with a university, and you would be sort of there as a member of staff almost. So they said, where do you want to go? And I said, well, I've got friends in Seattle. I went, okay. So they actually got me into UW, University of Washington at Seattle, and I was going to be part of the Crime and Justice program, and I had my own office and everything. I didn't know any of this. And I arrived there with my wife and our 3-month-old son. We're staying with friends for a few weeks. And they said, well, you better come in and see your office. And I went, my office? And by that time, we'd planned to buy a VW van and go driving around America, which we did. And by the time Fulbright and UW caught up with us, it was like we were Bonnie and Clyde on the run. I think we were in Nevada or somewhere and driving across Death Valley. And they said, well, you're supposed to be giving talks. You're supposed to have an office. And I went, well, see ya.
You know, that's actually when I met you for the first time was when it was in Seattle, and it happened that the big mystery conference, VoucherCon, took place in Seattle.
That wasn't that year. The year that I was in the States on the Fulbright was the year that the VoucherCon was in Toronto. Because we were in New York and we made a special trip, or no, Boston. We were in Boston. We made a special trip from Boston up to Toronto for that VoucherCon, and I was bewildered by it. I'd never been to anything like it before. I'd never seen anything like it before. And I remember walking into a bar or something, room of this big hotel near the railway station. And this woman came up to me and said, you look a bit lost. And I said, I am lost. And she said, well, my name's KK Beck. Come and meet some people. And she introduced me, and I forget exactly who, but it was like all the big names in mystery fiction were standing there next to KK Beck. And she saved my life, you know, and she became a friend, no longer on this planet. But she was great. And my wife and I fell in love with her books and fell in love with her. And yeah, that was my introduction to mystery writers. No, it wasn't. You know what? It wasn't, because when I was in Seattle that first time, I phoned up a couple of the newspapers saying, hey, it's newsworthy. I've arrived here. I'm Scottish and I'm a crime writer and I'm on a Fulbright thing. And they went, well, we're not interested, but there's a guy you might want to meet called Earl Emerson. He writes crime fiction. He's a fireman. He's a fireman, but he writes crime fiction. And sure enough, Earl said, yeah, let's meet up. And he introduced me to Stephen Greenleaf, the PI writer. And we used to go for drinks, and we would go into a cafe and we would hang out and have breakfast and stuff. And it was just such a lovely community. Everybody I met in the mystery community was just so welcoming to this naive, gauche twit whose English they couldn't even comprehend.
Well, it wasn't the English they couldn't comprehend, it was the Scots. But you're right, it was a lovely community in Seattle. And I was thinking about KK Beck the other day. She went on to meet and marry Michael Dibdin, who I thought was an incredibly talented, also left us way too soon.
It happens a lot. I mean, there's letters from Dibdin in my archive. There's a few letters between me and Dibdin. I became quite friendly with him. I interviewed him at the Edinburgh Book Festival one year. Went out for dinner and drinks afterwards. Yeah, they invited, when the VoucherCon was actually in Seattle, he and KK Beck invited a bunch of us, American and British writers, over to their two homes. They had two houses side by side, one house each they could work in. And we had a terrific party there. He was such a lovely guy, and such great books. The Aurelio Zen books are books that will be read 100 years from now.
I think so too. I wasn't as crazy about the TV adaptation. I think that today with serial television, it would have been kinder. And speaking of television, you and I had a conversation a while back about the fact that the Rebus had been televised in a 1 hour format, which hardly did the books justice. And you had been thinking about the possibility of them, you bought them back, if I remember right, about the possibility of them being turned into this longer form serial television. Is anything going on with that?
Oh, the gears are grinding awfully slow. There's a really great writer on board, and he has written a spec script, a pilot script, 2 hour script for what would be an 8 hour series, I would guess, 8 to 10 hour series. He's called Gregory Burke. He's written successfully for the stage. He's written Hollywood screenplays, you name it, he's done it. And he's from Fife, same part of Scotland as me. We're singing from the same hymn sheet as far as this goes. And he's turned in this really good script, and it's been with the BBC, the main broadcaster here, for what seems like 1,000 years, and nothing really has moved very far, and it's really frustrating. But we're waiting for the green light. We're waiting for somebody to say, "Yep, let's do this." And he keeps tweaking it and polishing it, and there's meetings upon meetings upon meetings. I'm not part of any of this. I just sit back and let it happen. I would love to see it back on TV. I think the way the television industry has changed makes it much more, amenable to long-form drama. When Rebus was first on TV, the thinking was, the philosophy was, people's intellect could only take very short bursts. So you do an hour, try and wrap the book up in an hour, or try and wrap the book up in 2 hours. And no, we like The Wire, and we like stuff that takes us on a big long journey. We want seasons of this stuff. So I think, if we want to do it long form, and the company that are working with me and working with Gregory Burke on it want it to be long form. We're just waiting for the BBC, who are the money people, to say yes.
Well, Edinburgh is such a main character in the book and so incredibly filmable. I mean, it's just a gorgeous city to be going around. And I've watched the Shetland series, which I thought was pretty well done. And interestingly enough, I'm trying to think of his name, but the lead in the Shetland series, he turns out to be, in season 1 of Outlander, he turns out to be a bad guy. He turns out to be part of this marauding watch, and he meets an inglorious end. He's hanged by the neck till dead and thrown off into a pit. But,
his name is Douglas Henshaw, Dougie Henshaw. He was in, there was a book of mine called Doors Open, which Stephen Fry turned into a one-off TV drama, a kind of 2 hour film for television. And Stephen Fry was in it with Dougie Henshaw, and that was a hell of a lot of fun. It was a heist set in Edinburgh, filmed pretty much on location everywhere we could. It's not easy to find, but if you can find it, it's one of those rare crime novels where nobody dies. There's plenty of tension because it's a heist. But in a heist, you don't need anybody to die. Thomas Crown Affair, you don't need anybody to die. You've got the tension. A, how are they going to get away with it? B, will they get away with it? C, have they got away with it? Because sometimes getting away with the loot is just the beginning of your problem. So I loved writing that. I wrote that for the New York Times. Years and years and years ago, they contacted me to do a serial for their Sunday magazine. I think they just got Michael Connolly to do one. And they'd contacted me and asked me if I would do a spy thing for them. And it was like 10 weekly installments, and it had to be just a few hundred words per installment. And I said, well, I'm not that interested in doing spies, but what about a heist? I absolutely love heists. And so I gave them what became Doors Open. And then, having used it for the New York Times, I then thought this would make a pretty good full-length novel. So I just extended it.
What's going on with Fulbright, if anything? I know that you started him off in the complaints, and I really enjoyed him, but he's only the lead character in what, 2 books?
Yeah. Well, the problem was that I found a way to bring Rebus back that was very interesting to me. And having brought Rebus back, I did bring Fox back, but only as a secondary character, I guess, because when Rebus is on stage, there's not much room for anybody else. So Fox is in all the most recent books. He's in the new one. The new one, takes Rebus up to the very far north of Scotland. It's almost a Shetland book. Don't tell her that. But it takes him way up to the north of Scotland for a case that involves Rebus's daughter. So he's way out of his comfort zone. And while he's away, there is a case ongoing in Edinburgh which involves Malcolm Fox and Siobhan Clarke. So you've got the two cases working out side by side, but at a distance, at a kind of distance of several hundred miles. So Rebus is only in Edinburgh for the first, 10 pages of this book. And after that, he's not anymore. So it's good because it gives Siobhan Clarke and Malcolm Fox a chance to, show their chops, to show what they can do and not be overshadowed by this larger than life character. And it also brings them into the orbit, I'm afraid, of well-known Edinburgh gangster Maurice Gerald Cafferty, who's trying to get his hooks into them in Rebus's absence.
It's so funny. The minute I said that, I realized that he was Malcolm Fox and Will Roby is actually a David Baldacci character. So I had a momentary brain freeze there. Which
it's difficult. It's awfully difficult. There's a Matthew Fox. Yeah, Matthew Fox. Yeah.
It is. So that's the book that's going to come out in October, maybe, or it may be postponed.
Hopefully, I think so. I mean, there's everybody. I mean, New York and London are singing from the same hymn sheet. They say it's going to come out in October. Yep. And I think it's great. I mean, it was a lot of fun to write. I started plotting it in September, October last year. Started writing it in November, which was a mistake. And I've never started a book in November before, and it was a mistake because on the run up to Christmas, I just had to put it to one side. I just put it to one side for a month and a half because my wife's mother arrived and her brother and stuff, and we had this, and we had that, we had New Year, and then we had something else. And so it was 6 weeks before I picked it up again. And it took me a while to get back in the groove. It took me a while to get my head back in the game. But thanks to the virus shutting down all my extracurricular activities, it was finished before my 60th birthday. So it was finished before the end of April. And I thought it was fine. I showed it to Miranda, my wife, and she gave me some feedback. I showed it to my agent and my editor, and they gave me some feedback. I went and tweaked it, did a further draft of it, taken on board some, not all of their suggestions. And then it got a little polish after that, and then off it went, and everybody seems to be very happy with it. I think it's slightly longer than the last one. What was the last one called? In a House of Lies. It's slightly longer than In a House of Lies. I was surprised. I thought it was going to turn out to be a short book. At one stage, I thought it was going to be a short book. And I never do word counts. I never do page counts while I'm writing. But at the end, I did do a word count, and it was 100 and something thousand. I thought I was going to be lucky to be 80, to be honest with you. I like short books. As I get older, I just like short books. I just think a lot of the books that I read these days are overblown. They need an editorial hand. I think the computer has been the curse of us in some ways because it's just so easy to keep writing. And also readers, I like readers because and publishers, because they say if you write a book over 300 pages, it's serious literature. It's no longer a whodunit. So we all got used to that notion that if we wrote a 500-page novel, it would be literature. Doesn't work.
I'm not sure that that's the rationale. I do find that there is too much middle in quite a lot of books, not yours particularly, but not even at all. But because I have to read so many books, all the time, there's so much pressure. I find myself often kind of leafing through the middle after a great setup. And I really believe Matt Walters years and years ago did a program at the store. And I've always remembered her comment that the end has to be as good as the beginning. It has to deliver the promise of the beginning or the book fails. And so I find in many books today that there's middle bridge that is almost like optional to make it work out. And also,
it's all about the twist. There's a twist halfway through the book. There's a twist coming, and once you're past the twist, you go, well, was that it? There's a lot of these kind of quite books that are very clever, but I'm never going to want to reread them. I mean, what I like in a book is character. I like character and place, and those are going to keep me going back and rereading books. And what I found in the lockdown is that while my writing has not been impaired in any way, my reading, it's difficult. It's difficult to pick up a big book. I thought I'd be reading bloody Dostoevsky and Proust, What else am I going to do during the lockdown? I'm going to read Proust. No, I'm going to short books, comfort books, books I've read before. I'm rereading them. Right at the moment, I'm halfway through A Dance to the Music of Time, which is one of my favorite series. 12 very short novels tracing quite a posh English guy's trajectory from school days to old age, taken in pretty much the whole of the 20th century of upper class English life. And they're just beautifully written, very elegant, funny, snobby, and filled with really amazing characters. And that keeps me, I finish one, I pick up the next one. I can't help myself. I will need to know what happens next to these characters. It's not the plot that it's not the most gripping plot in the world. It's somebody's life. It's not the plot, it's the characters and the sense of place and time. That's what I go for. I mean, it's true of crime fiction, I mean, twists, great if they work, but it's got to be a bit more than that, surely.
It does have to be more than that. I actually read for voice. If I am bored with the person telling me the story or people, then I find it hard to go on. And no matter how clever it is, it doesn't bond with me the way that a really powerful voice, I have to figure out every month which books we're going to promote out of hundreds of books coming our way. And it always comes down to that. And Patrick of our staff, Patrick Milliken, he's a great reader for voice also. So there are only really, if you think about it, so many plots. And in watching a lot of crime fiction on television recently, my husband and I at the dinner hour amuse ourselves that way. You can really recognize that there's no reason for a person to keep reappearing in a story that isn't the lead character, unless they're going to turn out to be essentially the villain. So my new standard is, why is this character here? And if there is no ostensible reason for them, then that basically this is being set up to be the bad guy in a play-fair thing.
I've always found it very difficult to teach. People always say, how do you write your books? And I go, well, I just make up as I go along. And it doesn't start with a twist for me. It doesn't start with the plot. What it starts with for me is wanting to explore Edinburgh, explore Scotland, explore social history, and find out a bit more about this guy Rebus. And it's a combination of those. It's needing to write more about him to make sense of him, and needing to write more about my country so I can make sense of it. It's recent history, it's economic history, what's happening right now, the mess we're in, how did we get here? All of that is what brings me to write the books, and eventually I find a plot that will allow me to do that. So in the latest book, for example, quite a long way through the first draft, I thought I knew who'd done it, but at the end it turned out it was someone else. And that didn't bother me in the least. The book told me who it thought did it, and I thought, okay, I'll go along with that then. I was wrong. I was wrong in my presumption of who the killer was. So I didn't know at the beginning, and it didn't bother me. It didn't bother me in the least. What I'm doing is as I'm writing the book, I'm finding my way towards what the theme and what the story are and how they want to be told. How does this story want to be told? And it will tell me. The book itself will tell me how to tell it.
Well, to wind this up, I'd like to circle back in my own thoughts to West Wind. I think it's fascinating that you can take a book that you wrote 30 years ago that was not a Rebus, that explored a different genre with different characters, and see where you thought it didn't work and see where you thought it did work, and revise it. I remember reading a comment that said that maybe you had had too much input from other people in that book, and it began to feel like somebody else had written it, not really you.
Yeah, I mean, my diaries of the time record this long, tortuous process where it went to publisher after publisher after publisher, during which time I think I also changed agents, and different editors got to look at it, different people wanted me to change different aspects of it until it felt like I was writing someone else's book and not mine. So when it started off, it was very comical. It was written almost as a comedy. And they said, no, take out the comedy, it's a thriller, it can't be comedic, it's got to be thrills, thrills, thrills. No, I didn't tweak it that much. I mean, when it came to republishing it, I could have taken it to pieces, stripped it, and put it all back together in a very different way. But I thought, no, I want people to read the book I wrote back then, not the book I would write now. So, for example, there aren't many strong women characters in it. And as a good friend of mine who's also a crime writer said to me, Ian, why do all the women wear stockings? what was going on in your life back then. You were so attracted to women in stockings. Everybody wears stockings. And it's true, when I looked at it, I thought, yeah, there's about 3 women characters in this, and 2 of them wear stockings. What's going on? But what does that say about me at that time in my life? I've no idea. But I didn't go back and change it to that extent. What I did was just tidy up some pretty clunky sentences, pretty clunky transitions. I must have been completely infatuated with the technology of car design, motor vehicle design. Central locking was a brand new thing in the UK, and by that I mean you turn the key in the lock and all the locks engage. This was a new thing, not remote locking, not pressing a button, but actually turning the key, because I mentioned it a dozen times in the book. And so what I did was go back and take out 11 of those mentions. I thought, I don't know what was going on in my head. I didn't own a car back then, so what was going on, I don't know. I just thought it was a fun thing. And that was what I did. I just tidied up some untidy and some flowery writing, and sadly didn't take out any mentions of silk stockings.
But what an interesting thing to do. I mean, you're obviously not the writer 30 years on that you were when you wrote it, but how wonderful that the book is sturdy enough, really, to have passed your own "is it republishable" test and made it work.
Peter May's just found the same thing. Peter May had a really old novel called something like, it's not called Quarantine, but it's something like that. Virus, Quarantine, something, Contagion, maybe even. But he's just found a publisher for it, obviously. And it's been published in the UK. So that's Peter May, a book that he wrote that nobody wanted a few years ago, suddenly finds itself very topical. So it's an accident of history that can happen. But it's nice what was nice about it, the nicest thing about it, Barbara, was it wasn't a crap book. I had thought I'd written a bad book. And when I went back and read it with hindsight, 30 years on, I had not written a bad book. I just had some bad memories of the process of getting it published.
Well, I'm really glad that it came out again in this your gap year between Rebus. And I'm sorry that you didn't get to come and discuss it with John Grisham at the Virginia Book Fair, but I'm glad you had time to talk to me about it. When we get more information about your Rebus book, we'll set up something, whether we're going to do this over again in a different context or with other people, or whether you actually get to come and visit us. We'll have to see. Meantime, my best to Miranda, and it was lovely to spend some time with you. Thank you for being so generous.
Well, I hope you can come and see us in our new apartment sometime, because it's got spectacular views.
I would love to. I remember the Edinburgh Festival that I came to, where I came to your beautiful Victorian house and you made me coffee. Still, I guess you learned
something stronger next time. Something stronger next time.
It'll be wonderful, Ian. But anyway, let's stay in touch, and thank you very much. Bye.
Love to you and yours. Bye now.
Okay.